Dawn broke cold over the Bavarian countryside on May 6, 1945. At 5:42 a.m., the mist still clung to the pine forests around the small ridge west of Regensburg, turning the world into a pale gray watercolor. The war in Europe had ended less than 24 hours earlier, yet the air smelled of burnt fuel, trampled earth, and fear that had not yet learned it could relax. As the first rays of sunlight brushed against a sprawling POW enclosure, once run by the Wehrmacht, now taken over by the U.S. 65th Infantry Division, American guards opened the gates for the first time. The war was over. The prisoners were free to go, but something deeply unsettling happened in that moment. Hundreds of German female auxiliaries, standing in neat rows behind the wire, did not move. The gates creaked open with the metallic groan of exhausted hinges. A U.S. sergeant, according to a field diary entry written that morning, waved a hand and shouted that the women could walk out whenever they wished. There was no more Reich to serve, no more chain of command to obey, no more danger pressing from the east or west. Yet the women remained frozen. Some clutched their overcoats as if bracing against an invisible wind. Others stared at the ground, and a few stared at the Americans with an expression that was neither defiance nor gratitude, something closer to dread. The guards expected cheers, tears, or at least confusion. What they received instead was refusal. The stillness felt unnatural, even eerie. Birds chirped on the fence posts. A supply truck rumbled somewhere in the distance. But inside the compound, silence settled heavy as winter snow. One American corporal whispered that it felt like walking into a church right after the priest announces the world is ending. The women made no attempt to escape, no moves toward the gate, no whispers among themselves. They simply waited, rigid, orderly, and obedient to rules that technically no longer existed. To understand this moment, the narration must rewind across the years of a collapsing Germany. Many of these women were not frontline soldiers but communications clerks, nurses, typists, radar assistants, and Luftwaffe auxiliaries. By the war's final winter, more than 500,000 German women served in roles supporting the military, a figure noted in a late-war German personnel report. They had been trained to follow orders with unwavering discipline. They had been told that surrender meant dishonor, and that American soldiers would treat them brutally. Rumors swept through the Reich during those last desperate months, whispered in shelters and printed between the lines of propaganda pamphlets. Americans killed prisoners. Americans humiliated women. Americans showed no mercy. And so, when the 65th Infantry Division swept across Bavaria in early May, advancing fast on routes still littered with bombed columns and abandoned panzers, the women were gathered as prisoners. They expected cruelty. Instead, they received food, blankets, and medical checks. They were stunned, suspicious, and silent. Many had marched for days, fleeing the Eastern Front where Soviet retribution grew infamous. Now they stood behind American wire, not because they were forced to remain, but because they believed stepping outside meant something far worse. The Americans, for their part, were equally uncertain. Many guards were only in their early 20s, carrying the exhaustion of months of combat in their shoulders. They had crossed the Danube under artillery fire, fought through pockets of SS resistance, and liberated the Gunskirchen camp just days earlier, a place of horror that left even hardened veterans shaken. Now suddenly, they were jailers of women who seemed terrified of freedom itself. It felt like stepping into a psychological minefield. No gunfire, no explosions, but tension coiled tight and invisible. By mid-morning, officers walked the perimeter, trying to speak with the women through interpreters. A few responded in short, clipped sentences. Many refused to speak at all. One interpreter later noted in his report that the women behaved as though freedom itself were a trap. They feared venturing into a world where the Reich had collapsed overnight, where their homes might already lie beneath Soviet occupation or Allied bombardment, where their families were unaccounted for, and where their uniforms, once symbols of order, now marked them as collaborators or traitors. Inside the wire they had food, safety, and the strange comfort of structure. Outside the wire there was only chaos. As the sun climbed higher, a handful of women stepped forward, but not toward the gate. They approached one another in whispered clusters, seeking assurance that staying put was safer than leaving. Their training still echoed in their minds. For years they had been told that discipline was protection, that obedience kept them alive. The uniform might have lost its authority, but the mindset had not. Even the sight of American medics distributing bandages and chocolate failed to break the psychological barrier. Around noon, an American lieutenant scribbled in his notebook that the camp felt like an island of ghosts. Freedom hovered only a few steps away, yet the women clung to captivity as though it were a lifeline. It was not loyalty to Hitler that held them in place. It was fear of a world that no longer resembled the one they had been conditioned to navigate. They did not trust the Americans' words, no matter how calmly offered. They did not trust the war's sudden end. They did not trust the future beyond the barbed wire. But there was another layer, one the Americans could not fully grasp. Many of these women knew what their units had been part of. Forced labor transport networks, communications relaying orders to frontline battalions, supply chains feeding collapsing armies. Even without direct involvement in atrocities, guilt hung in the air. Freedom meant facing that guilt. Remaining inside the wire meant postponing judgment. As evening shadows stretched across the camp, the Americans faced a baffling reality. They had come as liberators. They had opened the gates. And yet the prisoners, no longer prisoners, chose to stay. The lieutenant commander said nothing more, but his expression reflected the same unsettling realization spreading among the guards. Something deeper was happening here than shock or fear. Something hidden, something powerful. And by nightfall, as the lanterns flickered and the compound returned to darkness, only one question remained hanging in the stillness, one that Section 2 will confront directly. What force, what training, what secret psychological grip could make hundreds of people reject freedom the moment it was offered? The answer began long before that Bavarian dawn, in classrooms, barracks, and training halls where discipline was engineered with the precision of machinery. German female auxiliaries, signals operators, clerks, searchlight crews, and Flakwaff assistants were shaped by a system that insisted obedience was survival. A 1942 training manual for Luftwaffe Helferinnen emphasized absolute adherence to command hierarchy, embedding the notion that deviation invited danger. Even in collapse, those lessons did not evaporate. And it was this invisible conditioning that the Americans stumbled into when they opened the gates. But conditioning alone was not the full story. A deeper force, something almost architectural in its psychological design, held the women behind the barbed wire. That force was fear, sharpened by years of propaganda, according to a U.S. intelligence briefing compiled during the 65th Infantry Division's advance. German civilians routinely reported whispers that American troops brutalized female prisoners. Many of the women inside the camp had heard the same tales, repeated in shelters and train stations during the final months of chaos. Their instructors, retreating officers, and even scattered SS supervisors reinforced the narrative right up to surrender. The enemy will treat you as animals. A recollection from a signals operator later described how her commanding officer told them that capture meant dishonor worse than death. The Reich had collapsed, but its psychological scaffolding remained intact, gripping the women more tightly than any physical chain. Yet fear and propaganda alone do not fully explain why they rejected freedom after being offered it openly. The deeper, more practical reality was that the Americans possessed something the women lacked entirely: information. Outside the wire lay an unknown map of ruined towns, shifting borders, revenge-seeking militias, and refugee columns tens of miles long. Inside the wire, life was controlled, predictable, and crucially, safe. The U.S. Army's logistical system, backed by engineers from the Quartermaster Corps and technicians who had spent months maintaining truck fleets and field kitchens, provided structure and stability. The women recognized that stability instinctively. American order contrasted sharply with Germany's collapse, and in that contrast, captivity became a strange kind of sanctuary. This context forms the foundation for understanding what happened days later in a meadow near Landshut, when a second group of German female auxiliaries, nearly 800 of them, were encountered by the 11th Armored Division. Their story, recorded in company-level after-action summaries, reveals the technical and psychological underpinnings of their refusal. The women had marched for almost a week, sleeping in barns and ditches, believing themselves hunted by the Soviets and distrusting the Americans. When American half-tracks finally intercepted the column on May 7th, the women braced for violence. Instead, medics offered canteens of water and chocolate bars. A repair crew, led by a sergeant trained at the Ordnance School in Aberdeen, towed aside a disabled wagon that blocked the road. Kindness struck these women as a trap. The Americans tried escorting them toward a temporary holding area built from wire on wooden stakes hammered into the meadow soil. But once inside, the women refused to leave, much like those at Regensburg. The guards attempted to explain, through interpreters, that they could depart whenever they wished. No command compelled them to stay. But nearly the entire group remained. Some sobbed quietly. Others stared at the horizon where smoke from burning towns smeared the sky in thick gray streaks. Freedom had lost its meaning. The camp, crude as it was, became the only safe landmark left in a landscape of uncertainty. Understanding their refusal requires a deeper look into the machinery behind American operations. The U.S. Army's communication network, largely built on FM radio sets engineered by companies like Motorola and General Electric, enabled seamless movement and rapid response. That same network fed real-time updates to units managing refugees and POWs. Engineers, technicians, and ordnance specialists ensured supply columns could keep pace with advancing infantry. This infrastructure allowed Americans to offer stability even amid chaos. The women recognized the presence of that stability without understanding the mechanisms behind it. They did not know the names of the engineers who designed the radios that kept the U.S. forces synchronized. They did not recognize the logistics officers whose calculations ensured food arrived where it was needed. But they sensed the order those systems produced. The Germans, meanwhile, arrived at captivity with broken chains of command and shattered doctrines. Their belief that surrender meant abuse persisted even when American behavior contradicted every expectation. In one intelligence summary compiled after interviews with surrendered auxiliaries, several admitted they thought the Americans' kindness was a prelude to something terrible. The psychological dissonance was overwhelming. If an enemy behaves better than propaganda claimed, then every other part of the worldview taught for years might also be false. For many women, remaining behind the wire postponed that reckoning. The barbed fence was not just a physical boundary. It was a psychological barrier protecting them from a world that demanded they rethink everything. This dynamic reached its peak during a confrontation on May 10th, when American officers attempted to dissolve part of the temporary enclosure near Landshut to reduce strain on supply lines. The plan was simple: open one side of the wire and inform the women they were free to return home. Instead, chaos erupted, not because the women tried to escape, but because they tried to stay. Witnesses recounted how dozens rushed toward American guards, pleading in fragmented English and German not to be forced into the open. Others fell to their knees. A medic, in his field notes, wrote that the women behaved like refugees clinging to the last solid ground before being swept into a flood. The Americans were stunned. They had liberated concentration camps where prisoners sprinted toward freedom and embraced their rescuers. Here, the opposite was happening. These were not prisoners held against their will. These were people begging not to be released. The contradiction gnawed at the guards. It challenged their assumptions about victory, liberation, and humanity. It suggested that even when the shooting stopped, war's deepest wounds left invisible fractures. The tension finally forced the Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. These women did not fear captivity. They feared the unknown, and the unknown now stretched across every road, river, and horizon of a shattered Europe. But one deeper layer remained, one that Section 3 will reveal fully. Because the women's refusal to leave was not just about fear or propaganda or collapse. It was about identity, guilt, and the psychological vacuum left when a totalitarian system suddenly evaporates. And in that vacuum, the barbed wire felt safer than freedom. In the days that followed, the Americans realized they were navigating not a military problem, but a psychological crisis born from a regime that had shaped identity as tightly as boots laced around ankles. The Reich had collapsed in a matter of weeks, but the mindset it engineered over 12 years did not crumble with it. Post-war army psychological assessments noted that many German auxiliaries showed signs of identity detachment, unable to imagine themselves outside the uniforms they had worn, the orders they had followed, or the hierarchy that had structured their days. Their refusal to leave the wire reflected that collapse of inner scaffolding. Freedom was not a doorway, it was a void, and the void terrified them far more than captivity. Across Bavaria, the Americans witnessed the same pattern. Camps holding women from signals regiments, Luftwaffe ground crews, and RAD auxiliaries reported high reluctance to disperse. Engineers responsible for setting up temporary enclosures, men trained in the Corps of Engineers at Fort Belvoir and accustomed to bridging rivers or clearing mines, found themselves improvising shelters instead of demolishing them, because the women inside begged to stay. Supply officers logged unexpected ration demands because groups that were supposed to disperse remained together instead. What was meant to be a few days of supervision turned into weeks. The psychological shock spread even among U.S. troops hardened by the Ardennes and the push to the Danube. They had expected surrender, relief, or defiance, not pleas for continued imprisonment. A post-war interview with an infantry captain revealed a remark that captured the strangeness. "We came to break the wire. They treated it like a home." For American soldiers raised on democratic ideals, the women's behavior was incomprehensible. But the war had not just broken Germany's army. It had broken Germany's sense of what a future could be. Over the next month, as the U.S. Army's occupation structure took shape, efforts were made to integrate the women into the broader civilian landscape. Notice boards were erected at camps with information about safe travel corridors, transport schedules, and housing assistance. Civil affairs teams, relying on logistics frameworks designed years earlier by planners at the Army Service Forces, attempted to reassure the women that the countryside beyond the wire was stabilizing. But every attempt met resistance. Many women feared revenge if they returned home. Others feared starvation if they ventured into towns stripped bare by scorched-earth retreat. A former teleprinter operator told an interpreter, according to a report filed at the division headquarters, that she would rather sleep on straw behind wire than bleed on a road. The Americans gradually came to understand that they were dealing with women who associated uniformity, order, and enclosed space with protection. The Reich had built a world where instructions dictated every movement and deviation felt like danger. And now, without those instructions, they were unmoored. Inside the wire they had routines, wake-up times, meal lines, medical checkups, nightly roll calls. Outside, nothing had definition. For people shaped by a militarized society, structure was not oppression, it was identity. The strategic effect of this phenomenon rippled beyond the camps. The U.S. occupation authorities recognized that rebuilding Germany required more than disarming soldiers and feeding civilians. It required dismantling a mindset. Analysts from the Information Control Division warned that millions were emerging from the most comprehensive indoctrination apparatus of the modern era, a system that fused nationalism, obedience, fear, and belonging. Female auxiliaries, though rarely combatants, had lived closest to the machinery of that system. They had been its clerks, its communicators, its logistical sinew. Their refusal to disperse was proof that liberation alone could not untangle the mental chains Hitler's regime had forged. Meanwhile, the psychological contrast between the Americans and the surrendered auxiliaries deepened. For the U.S. Army, war was something fought and then finished. For the women, the war was something that had shaped them so completely that its end left them hollow. Many could not imagine who they were without duty rosters, signal codes, or uniformed supervisors. Some had never lived independently. Some had never traveled alone. And many carried guilt about what they had transmitted, supplied, recorded, or enabled in the war's machinery. Guilt became another invisible wire holding them in place. That emotional burden surfaced consistently in occupation-era interrogations. Many auxiliaries admitted that they feared judgment from their families or communities. In their minds, staying behind American wire delayed that judgment, like holding breath underwater a little longer. A U.S. military chaplain wrote that they acted as though stepping outside meant stepping into a courtroom. By mid-June, the Americans understood that the wire had become symbolic. It no longer represented captivity. It represented certainty. And that certainty became a barricade against a Europe swirling with refugees, border shifts, and political power vacuum. The Americans had intended to free them. But freedom, to someone who no longer recognized the world, felt indistinguishable from danger. Slowly, over weeks, the wire emptied. Not by force, but by attrition. Word spread that towns were reopening markets. Transport trucks began carrying civilians toward larger cities. Housing bureaus in Munich and Augsburg posted lists of available shelters. Life's ordinary rhythms, imperfect, unpredictable but real, began to return. And as they did, women stepped out one by one, often clutching blankets or small bags, each carrying more fear than belongings. Some walked toward distant villages. Others boarded trucks headed for displaced person processing centers. They stepped beyond the wire not because they embraced freedom, but because the world beyond it reassembled just enough to look survivable. The long-term impact of their hesitation would shape both memory and policy. For occupation planners, it demonstrated that rebuilding Germany required rebuilding minds, not just roads. For the U.S. Army, it revealed the quiet psychological wreckage left after totalitarian collapse. And for the women themselves, it marked the beginning of lives that would forever straddle two worlds, the structured obedience of their past and the uncertain freedom of their future. In the decades that followed, historians combed through the diaries, reports, and interviews left behind. Many noted that these women never described the wire as a prison. They described it as the last place where they understood the rules. They recalled American soldiers not as captors, but as anchors steadying a landscape that had dissolved beneath them. And they remembered the moment the gates opened not as liberation, but as the instant when they realized just how much they had lost. Not land, not victory, but identity. As one former auxiliary would remark years later in a private letter, her words carrying the echo of a whole generation, "The Americans set us free, but freedom is frightening when you no longer know who you are.